Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to come today to University of Western Sydney. My name is Matt Hanlon. I'm a Chief Inspector of Police attached to the Mental Health Intervention Team, and I'll explain a little bit about that through the course of the session. My background in policing, just as a matter of interest, so you know where I'm coming from, 32 years in the police. I've been a Chief Inspector now for 15 years, and I've been at a number of local area commands around this part of Sydney, mainly Bankstown, Campsie, Marrickville areas. A lot of time in the eastern suburbs as well, and coming from the Sutherland Shire, a little bit of time down there as well. So Liverpool's not overly familiar to me, but it's certainly appreciated that you've all come today, especially in the middle of a school holiday and Easter break period, so I do appreciate your attendance. What I'm going to go through today is basically a modified session of what the students who attend the mental health 4-day course would get through the course of their training. Just to explain things a little bit in terms of what the police actually get, every recruit that comes out of the academy receives a 1-day training on mental health called the Mental Health Workshop. That workshop gives them a very broad, very high level overview of a whole range of mental health issues facing New South Wales Police Force officers in the course of their duties. Beyond that, we have a 4-day course, which this is the opening session for, and that 4-day course is eligible to any police officer who wishes to apply to go and undertake the course. We hold them up at Collaroy, there in northern beaches of Sydney. We are very limited though. We only do 300 officers per year, and it's quite competitive. Sometimes we have people that said that they waited up to 7 years to get on our course, which is unbelievable. And sometimes people can get on a lot shorter, but it's quite well regarded and well appreciated as a course. We get great feedback from the police officers wondering why they didn't get this training earlier in their careers, because it is quite involved and quite a higher level of understanding in relation to things that they do on a daily basis. Through the course of the slides today, I'm going to show you some statistics on what police do in terms of mental health and mental health interventions. You may be surprised at the figures, and we'll talk about those figures and we'll compare them to, say, other agencies such as New South Wales Ambulance, who are the lead agency in terms of transportation of mentally ill people from the community into treatment. However, you'll be surprised how many times police, in fact, are substituted for that purpose. We'll also share with you a lived experience of mental health, because in the 32 years of policing, I've come to many jobs and engaged with many victims and witnesses and offenders who have a mental health illness or a mental health condition, disorder or disturbance. And it might surprise you, it may not, but up to 40% of the community may at any one time actually have a mental illness. So a mental illness can be quite temporary. It can last a period of a couple of days or a couple of hours, but also can be more persistent and ongoing. And oftentimes it's the people with those persistent long-term mental illnesses that we engage with in a more passive way, in a more proactive way, I guess. However, we get a great deal of reactionary jobs for people who have short-term or acute mental illnesses, and we'll talk about the difference between the two as we go along. As I said to you before, I'm going to talk about a lived experience for me about 10 years ago, and I believe that many of you in the room may even be familiar with it. I was the duty officer in charge of a police shooting. Now, that police shooting involved a young fellow by the name of Adam Salter, and it's on public record, and many of you may have even viewed that in your studies, of the incident that took place back in November 2009, and what transpired for both the family and certainly for the police officers involved. And I'll be able to give you, if there's questions about it, a very deep insight as to what occurred over those 7 years of investigation that ultimately led to the acquittal of 4 police officers on quite serious charges in relation to that matter. So, as I said, we'll go through and we'll have questions at the end if that's okay with everyone. But if there's something that's really pressing, by all means, and it's relevant to where we're up to, I'm more than happy to cut to the chase and answer that and address your concerns. Just to give you a bit of an understanding about the mental health intervention team in the New South Wales Police Force, we were formed as a pilot project back in 2007. 2 senior officers at the time travelled overseas, and they visited a number of jurisdictions, including the US. In the US, they actually found a crisis intervention team model, which was located, from memory, down in Tennessee. And they examined that model fairly thoroughly and believed that it had merit and was able to be brought back to Australia. Of course, crisis intervention and mental health intervention, slightly different language in terms of what's appropriate in Australia, in New South Wales, and therefore it went from crisis intervention to mental health intervention team. And those words were relevant to the legislation at the time, and they still are, because we have a Mental Health Act, not a Crisis Intervention Act, and also relates very well to our key stakeholders being New South Wales Health and also the New South Wales Mental Health Commission. So around about 2,900 police have actually undertaken the 4-day course, which is the penultimate level of mental health training that New South Wales Police can receive in the course of their duties. They're certainly welcome to go outside of the police force in terms of tertiary education, and that's encouraged. However, the vast majority of police have only fairly limited contact in terms of mental health issues from a theoretical perspective, so therefore the 4-day training tends to be the bulk of training that they ever receive. The team's only small. It's myself as the manager. We have a senior policy officer who does research and assesses a whole range of strategic and policy areas, as well as a sergeant of police who's my coordinator, who can't be with us today. But their role is effectively to coordinate and assess the training opportunities that we have, because not all the training is simply structured into the 1 and then to the 4 days. Quite often we have very specific specialised commands within the organisation, and if you're not familiar with the police, you might be surprised to find out we've got more than 115 specialist commands within the one organisation of New South Wales Police Force. So those business units, if you like, have a whole different range of activities and obligations, and a lot of those areas actually cross over or have contact with the community, where a mental illness or disorder can in fact be a telling factor or an important area for which they have to negotiate. I'll give you a couple of examples. We have the firearms registry, which is located on the north coast of New South Wales. Obviously, we have people applying for firearms licences. As you've read in the media and you would probably be aware of, we have had matters where licensed firearm owners have in fact unlawfully used those firearms to kill innocent persons. Oftentimes it's in relation to domestic violence matters, and therefore it's really critical that the staff at the firearms registry, for example, receive specialist training around the areas of mental health and mental illness, so they can start to look at factors or triggers that may be obvious when a person's applying for a licence. The other area that we've just finished with around the state was the Youth Command. Many of you would know that the leading cause of death in New South Wales for 15 to 24-year-olds is in fact suicide. And as a result of suicide being such a major risk to young people, we took it upon ourselves to engage with the Youth Command, who are located, as you imagine, across the state. And we travelled to various locations and provided them with training around suicide prevention, identifying suicide risk indicators and general areas of self-harm that young people would be exposed to. And we did that so that those police who are already working with those young people can in fact start to pick up on those triggers and identify those issues. You'll also see there that we deliver training to New South Wales Ambulance. It might surprise you because Ambulance and Health are the leading agency in terms of mental illness. It's in fact it's required by us, or required from us, that we provide them with some training, mainly around their powers, and that's powers to use force, searching powers by ambulance officers for people with a mental illness if they're taking those persons into health treatment, so transporting them by ambulance. Also too is that a better understanding of what the police role is, so that when both agencies attend a job in the community and there might be a need to take that person into treatment, it's important for ambulance and police to understand each other's roles so the appropriate application of the legislation can be used. And that's Section 20 for New South Wales Ambulance and Section 22 for New South Wales Police Force. The other area that we look at, of course, is the Australian Federal Police. We've provided training for the AFP for many years, mainly because a number of sites that the AFP oversee and respond to, including the airport, are areas that draw a high range or a high number of mentally ill people. Now, you wouldn't imagine that when you travel on your last flight or you're gone on your last vacation. However, the airport does tend to be promoted into individuals where they feel that they want to travel overseas and make some decisions, or they're having a referential or religious delusion that they will travel overseas and make contact with a high-profile person. It might be President Trump, it might be the leader of North Korea, and try and fix those issues as they see them. And of course, that's not going to happen because these people are travelling without a passport, often without a ticket or any means to purchase a ticket. So the AFP do capture a whole range of people that come to them for that purpose. And of course, the training is really important because they're intervening with those people, oftentimes at a higher risk level or when those people are highly agitated. And as I said before, it's only a small team and we do travel around the state, but it's really important that we get the information out to police officers particularly because they are dealing with a high number of incidents every day, and I'll lead you through that. One of the other important parts of the mental health intervention team is developing up tools for police. Now, sometimes those tools need to be applied internally as well. For example, draft suicide prevention plan isn't necessarily for the public. In fact, the suicide prevention plan can also be for police officers. And unfortunately, New South Wales police officers are exposed to significant risk in the course of their duties. So as a result, they oftentimes need more support and more services made available to them in order to manage the effects of those exposures. We also have an MOU, which is a Memorandum of Understanding between ourselves, New South Wales Police, and the lead agency, New South Wales Health. It's a fairly large document, and many of you may or may not have ever read that document online, which is publicly available. It's about 63 pages, but it takes the reader through the entire journey for a person who's mentally ill, from the time that they become unwell and seek treatment, right through to the stages of being scheduled by the police under the Mental Health Act or by ambulance, and also the powers that those agencies have to ensure that person's retainment, if you like, in treatment. And therefore, if people abscond or they become violent in hospitals, the MOU covers that area for the three agencies being health, ambulance and police. Coronial recommendations are highly important to New South Wales Police because they often shape what we do in terms of our policing practice. Many of you might be aware of matters such as Courtney Topic, where a young lady was shot and killed by police back in February 2015 out at Hoxton Park, not far from where we are today. The reason why I bring that one up is particularly there's a lot of footage on social media around the shooting of that young lady, and it gives people, I guess, a greater exposure, if you like, to what would be seen as possibly detrimental actions by the police on that day. Now, that matter was finalised by the coroner back on July last year, and a number of recommendations have been made, and New South Wales Police, via the MHIT and other specialised areas, are working towards addressing those recommendations. One of the key factors that came out of that coronial recommendation was, in fact, the issue of time. So, from memory, the time of that incident from arrival to fatal discharge of a firearm was about 44 seconds. Now, that may shock you, as it shocks many police officers and certainly ambulance officers when we give the presentation, as to why was it so quick? Why did the matter erupt or escalate to such a severe degree where somebody could be shot and then, unfortunately, in those circumstances, killed? A lot of the training that New South Wales Police undertake is all about risk assessing. And as a result of the risk assessments made by those officers, and I certainly make no qualms about the decisions they made. However, risk is very subjective. So for an individual officer to be at a scene where there's a person with a knife, possibly threatening with that knife or that weapon, individual police will make their own personal risk assessment. And obviously that risk assessment, as I said, is subjective and can change from officer to officer based on their experience levels, their confidence levels and their capability levels. So if somebody's quite capable in terms of their tactical options, might be taser or OC spray or baton, they may feel a different sense of risk compared to somebody who's either more inexperienced or does not have the same confidence or in terms of their own capabilities. So as a result of that, we had 3 officers that attended that incident, took a number of steps, to try and resolve that incident without resorting to a firearm. However, ultimately a firearm was used and that young lady unfortunately passed away. So in our training, we have to recognise the differences between officers in terms of their experience levels, and we try to give them broad engagement around de-escalating. So that's the opposite. So to de-escalate the situation using some principles that we train down at the academy, we call it STOPR, which is an acronym for a range of activities that police would do when they attend a situation. Can be any situation, but certainly a high-risk situation. So around the coroner's recommendations, really important that police work closely with those recommendations to try and bring about more peaceful resolutions in high-risk mental health interventions. It may not always be possible, and as I tell the police officers in the classes, there will be incidents where you will not be able to de-escalate. It's just a reality. Sometimes circumstances, the weapon that's being presented or the threat that's, that they're being exposed to really limits their ability to de-escalate. However, the principles of de-escalation are often based on time and increasing the use of time, as well as distance. And we do a number of different scenarios through the course of the 4-day training that we provide police, where we try to focus in on utilising that time more effectively. So when I say time, I mean slowing the matter down or the process down, trying to engage with the subject or the person who's at risk, and trying to utilise other skills rather than their tactical options. So when I say tactical options, I'm talking about firearm, I'm talking about baton or spray or taser. However, they also have a very strong tactical option, being their verbal commands and their ability to communicate with the individual. And as I said, it's not always follows the right procedure, and it doesn't always work effectively, but we certainly encourage police officers in the first instance to try communications as the first response. And that's because it's effective in every other instance or engagement we have with the community, and therefore it's an appropriate starting point for police officers to try and de-escalate. The other thing, as I said before, is distance. Reaction time for police officers, if we tell them, if you get too close to an individual who's presenting a threat, a risk or a weapon, you reduce your reaction time to dealing with that threat. If you have a further distance away, and we talk about sort of 5 metres plus being away from the person, you can still communicate effectively. You can certainly demonstrate empathy and give some authority to your commands. However, you're not in a greater position of danger than you are if you're at 2 metres away, for example. So where we've had instances where police have shot and killed an individual, or even just shot an individual, it's oftentimes because the distance is too close. Now, that happens for a couple of reasons. One is that the individual themselves may come towards police, and if police have no further options, feel that they are then required to use force because there's no obvious withdrawal or escape route. Two is that human nature again takes over, and when somebody doesn't respond or comply to a direction, we raise our voices, thinking that louder or greater volume would in fact improve the ability for someone to comply, when in fact, of course, it doesn't. But police will do that like human nature, where they'll start to raise their voices, repeat the commands, or get closer. And oftentimes, if you know yourselves, when you're having conversations with individuals, if they're not accepting or responding the way you expect them to, oftentimes we move forward. But in a high-risk situation, that can be lethal for either the police officer involved or the individual. The other specialised training that we do, we look at the taser review for across the state, and we examine how police either used or could better use tasers in future, and we make certain recommendations. We also give feedback from stakeholders such as the New South Wales Mental Health Commission or New South Wales Health. This table here represents a whole range of data, and as you can see, it's over 4 years, from 2015 right through to 2018 being last year. It covers a range of areas where police are involved with mentally ill people across the broader sectors, and they are representing different types of incidents that police would get called to. If I can take your eyes down to section 22, which is the predominant section that police use for interventions with the mentally ill, is you'll see that there is, of course, an increase year to year, which is not necessarily unpredictable given the increases in population numbers, but also to the growing nature of mental illness in the community. You'll see there from over the years, and slightly obscured, but the last figure there in 2018 is 14,724. So that means that that's the number of interventions that New South Wales police officers engage with mentally ill, disordered or disturbed persons, requiring them to take them to a hospital or to a declared mental health facility for the purposes of medical assessment. That figure, if you those who do the sums quite quick in their head, would know that it's about 40 incidents a day. Now, those 40 incidents a day represent just the recorded number of incidents where police have led that intervention. Of course, family members, GPs, other health professionals, or in fact ambulance and New South Wales Health can also play a role, and those numbers may not be represented there in the table. So it gives you an understanding of they're just police matters where the number of people have been taken in for treatment, as I said. Now, the argument would be that if police shot and killed no persons last year, then we had 14,724 successful interventions. So, of course, when there are incidents, and we'll use the Courtney Topic matter back in 2015, there were 12,347 other incidents that were more successful and that didn't result in lethal force being used. But it gives you some understanding about how prolific the role and requirement for police is in dealing with the mentally ill. And to give you some comparative example, New South Wales Ambulance in the very same year in 2018 did less than 4,000. So the understanding, I guess, is about stigma here, because why would New South Wales Police, who are less equipped, less trained and less clinically capable, be the lead agency in mental illness? And the reality is, certainly from my experience, is it is all about stigma. Stigma is what I guess we'd class when people see the mentally ill in the community. It might be somebody who's yelling or acting unusually in the community as a result of their illness, that people in the community will in fact call the police first. And they do that because there is a fear related to that person, that individual's behaviour. So rather than thinking, oh, that's a health issue, we should get the ambulance down because they can treat them better, people start to become fearful because they don't either understand the illness, they see the behaviour and see the risk rather than what might be causing it, which is understandable given the lack of broader knowledge in the community around mental illness. And equally too, it's around about people saying, well, quick, we'll get the police and they will get the ambulance. So sometimes it's the misunderstanding about the agencies and how they can be responded to. Equally too, and this is being frank about resources available, there are in fact more police vehicles and police officers in local area commands than there are ambulance. So as a result, there's a greater likelihood, if you like, of police turning up or attending these incidents as the first vehicle or the first responder. So as I said before, with a large number of incidents, yet only 300 of our officers are getting trained. So if we had 300 officers in the 4-day course, comparing that to the number of incidents, you'll see that many of our police officers rely upon their 1 day of training. So that 1 day of training in the academy may have been 4 or 5 years ago, or it might have been longer since they undertook that specialised training. Now, whilst some things do change in the course of clinical aspects in relation to mental illness, the role of New South Wales police officer hasn't really changed since 1843. And that's when police first received their powers to actually apprehend or detain a person with a mental illness that may pose a public safety risk. Throughout the MOU, and I referred to that document earlier, there's a whole range of aspects there to do with public safety. And New South Wales Police are the lead agency within that MOU for public safety. It shouldn't surprise you, given the fact that Ambulance and New South Wales Health are in fact the lead agencies for the treatment and recovery of persons. So therefore, the distinction being that where there's a public safety matter, and you can see that through the data, there's a higher obligation there on police. Once the person's being calmed or is able to go into treatment either willingly or without incident, then the police role tends to dissipate and it becomes purely a health or clinical issue. Down the bottom, you'll also see a total figure there of 42,910 incidents. It may seem a lot to you, but if you understand the general nature of police incidents across New South Wales, in comparison, there are 160,000 domestic violence incidents in New South Wales last year. There's a high percentage of those where one or more parties are in fact affected by mental illness, disturbance or disorder. So that might mean that one party within a domestic violence incident is in fact unwell at the time of that incident or leading up to that incident. But equally too, it could be both parties. So where there's both parties affected by an illness or a disorder that's mental health related, can pose a big challenge to police, particularly junior police, in relation to how they manage that incident. And when you take into account a further complexity of personality disorders, which more of the community actually have at any one time than an illness, you start to understand the complex nature of dealing with dysfunctional relationships purely from a legal perspective. Now, I'm not an expert on domestic violence. However, police have never been faced with more obligations or challenges to protect people than they are today. 32 years ago, when I joined the police, very simple process of removing the parties from the location and then going to a court to apply for an AVO. Now the process is a lot more complex, where they actually film and record the victims at the scene. So that sounds obviously more practical, and it's a better development in terms of evidence for court. But what you also have to understand is that that also makes a greater challenge where one or two of the parties, given the high percentage that exist, are in fact mentally ill or affected by mental illness or disorder. So it makes it more challenging in terms of gaining evidence, believability and compellability of witnesses, because all of a sudden a party's telling you a certain version of what occurred, but it may be distorted by that illness, a delusion, hallucination, or even just a severe disturbance of mood can alter and affect the evidence that's provided to police and makes that investigation far more challenging. So down there, as you see from that data, there's a whole number of incidents that police will go to with mental health as an associated factor. And again, as I said before, poses a great challenge to police, not only in terms of de-escalating and calming the person, also the challenge of getting them to health, to an emergency department or to a declared mental health facility for the purposes of treatment, but also too in investigating other matters that are part of the greater number of incidents they go to. And that could be anything as simple as not having a ticket whilst riding a train and being identified at the railway station by police transport command officers, but equally too it might be in relation to more serious crime matters, organised crime or serious crime where mental illness is a factor. We also know that counter-terrorism, police are often faced with individuals that have a mental illness or disorder or disturbance, and that can be around their fixation on certain issues, and those issues can translate to social media or into the public place in another way. So as a result of that, police are forced to deal with those people, and oftentimes it's a health solution rather than a legal solution, because with those Section 22 individuals, those 14,000, that number there that I've showed you, is that oftentimes it'll be a diversion away from the criminal justice system based on their behaviour or conduct, rather than having the treatment solely applied and then also going through the legal process, through the court process. I'll answer any questions about those as we go through. I'm just about to show you the lived experience, and I touched on it before, and I believe that you may have actually viewed the ABC Four Corners program on the Adam Salter shooting. This is in fact the first 2 minutes of that presentation with the courtesy of ABC Four Corners for the purposes of educating police and certainly yourselves today. So I'm not sure if we could turn the lights down, we may not need to, but I'll just play you this 2 minutes, have a listen, and then we'll go through a bit of a story.
At 8:39 a.m. on Wednesday, November the 18th, 2009, a distraught father in Western Sydney called 000.
ambulance emergency. What's the problem? Tell me exactly what's happened.
Attempted suicide. My son has stuck a knife in his chest. There's lost a lot of blood. He's got a puncture in the lung, I think. And he's in a bad way.
At 8:51 a.m, as an ambulance arrived at the scene, police radio issued a call for cars to assist.
Local Camp Scaling to the vicinity for a self-harm incident. 1G Road at Lakemba, across Lakemba Street. 35-year-old male with a self-inflicted stab wound to the chest.
At 2 minutes past 9, an officer at the house called for backup.
Yeah, careful for urgent further police to this location, please.
Over there.
Something had gone badly wrong, as police and ambulance officers separately reported.
So we've had shots fired from Kempsey 14, shots fired. Just cutting away ASAP. Kempsey 10 metres.
Incident at Lakemba, self-inflicted stab wound. Now it appears that the police may have shot the patient.
The man with the knife was 36-year-old Adam Salter, and he died not from self-inflicted stab wounds, but from a police bullet. It's a death that should never have happened.
Okay, so there's an assumption, I guess, that many of you have seen that and watched that program. I myself was Campsie 10. You heard the call sign being called there in the footage, which meant that I was the duty officer or inspector in charge that day of the Campsie command. And as a result, I went to that job. And obviously, it's a matter for public record now because it's recorded by the coroner. It's also recorded by the Police Integrity Commission, and I'll explain that shortly, about what transpired that day, what the officers did, and in relation to that matter, and what eventually occurred in result of the court process that followed. But to give you an understanding in sort of public terms, is that the incident, as you saw there, where the male person had stabbed himself, caused self-harm, and we can relate that to a psychosis, where through a mental illness, a person loses insight about their own abilities, who they are, what's going on in their mind, and as a result, led them to take that severe action of self-harming with a knife. It's important to remember that they weren't harming other people, they were just simply harming themselves, which again points more towards a mental illness than criminal behaviour. So in the course of that, as you saw there, ambulance were called in the first instance, which was a particularly important move there by the informant, being the father, because ambulance was in fact the treating agency or the lead agency for that incident. Of course, when ambulance got down there, they see a stabbing. They're not sure what they're encountering. They're also worried about their own safety, of course. So they called police and made sure that police attended. So police go down there initially just to make an assessment, review if you like, about what evidence is available and to determine whether or not a criminal offence has occurred. In terms of suicide or attempted suicide, that was repealed legislation almost 32, 33 years ago. So before then, it was actually a criminal offence to attempt to commit suicide, and you would go before a magistrate with a punishment or a penalty likely to be issued. That changed, as I said, over 30 years ago. So it's no longer an offence, it's simply just a health issue that needs to be dealt with. So as I said before, ambulance were first on the scene and police have followed based on the advice that it may be something that required investigation. So again, on public record, the information's available there in terms of the police evidence and the ambulance evidence. However, the situation was that Mr. Salter was being treated by ambulance in the kitchen of that residence, and at the time 4 paramedics were working on him to keep him alive and to treat his injuries with the intention of getting him to hospital for those injuries. At the time, the most junior police officer with about 6 months service was told to stay in the room while the more experienced police officers left the kitchen area and went to another part of the house to interview the father to establish if there's been any criminal behaviour or what the situation was in fact. I guess in doing so, by leaving the room, they were allowing the ambulance to work uninterrupted. they also was, I guess, a little bit of dignity for the father, the informant, to take him from the room to allow them to try and calm him down and again, get a version of events to find out exactly what had happened. But in making those decisions, police, I guess, put themselves in a more precarious situation. And again, no criticism, because I wasn't there at the job at the time. I arrived shortly after. But the reality for this incident was that despite those injuries, Adam Salter was able to push those 4 ambulance officers away and get to his feet. Now, it's again a matter of public record through evidence that when he was able to get to his feet, he leaned towards the kitchen sink of the area that he was in, and that's where he found that knife that he'd used earlier. And police obviously believed, based on his injuries, that that knife had been secured, but it hadn't. And as a result of that decision, he was then able to rearm himself and then continue to self-harm. And the evidence states that he was stabbing himself in the neck with that knife, I guess with the intention of ending his life. But of course, once he was rearmed with that weapon, he again presented a threat or a risk. So the police officer in the room, along with the ambulance officers, then needed the police back in the room to take control of the situation. And as we said before in the MOU, to maintain the public safety aspect, even in a private property. So they ran back into the room or towards the kitchen down a small hallway. The reality is what the officer in the lead saw made her believe that Adam Salter was going to use that knife on another person because of the way it was being held and the close proximity of those other individuals being the 4 ambulance officers and also that junior police officer. So that officer made a decision and fired 1 round of their police service firearm. That struck the right shoulder blade or scapula of Mr. Salter, and as a result of the density of that bone, and I'm not a clinician, but clearly that was what occurred, that bullet then ricocheted across into the aorta of the heart and severed the aorta, leading to almost instant death. So paramedics then applied the necessary first aid. Those same paramedics that were treating the self-harm injuries were then applying medical treatment for a police gunshot wound. As a result of that, they did what they needed to do, and police obviously set up a crime scene in order to fulfil the protocols of what New South Wales Police refer to as a critical incident. And part of that critical incident investigation is to call my position, which is the duty officer, which I did, come down to the job a few minutes later and assess the criminal aspects and the protocol aspects of that incident. Now, to give you some understanding, what that means is that the police were subject to alcohol and drug testing. They were examined for gunshot residue on their hands in order from a criminal perspective, to ensure that only one officer had in fact used their firearm and in fact how many shots had been fired. It was only 1. But the ongoing process of that was obviously that Adam Salter was taken to Canterbury Hospital, which was close by, and unfortunately passed away. On the scene, in my own situation, was all important to maintain the scene, because of course we now have to investigate what's just happened. Even if the police officers were the purpose or the reason why it happened, we still have to investigate thoroughly. And that means that we investigate it just like any other homicide where a person has died, irrespective of the weapon, but it's certainly in the case of a firearm, the same processes apply. So we have a number of police that get called out. I won't bore you with the intimate details of that incident, but certainly it's suffice to say that after a period of time, that matter went before the New South Wales coroner, and certain recommendations or findings were made by the coroner which implicated the police officers. Now, there was no aspect of that in relation to their criminal use of the firearm, but it was in fact whether or not police had all told the truth in relation to their version of events that led up to the shooting. If I take you further down the track, down to 2016, so if you imagine the incident occurred on the 18th of November 2009, we're now in June 2016. And in June 2016, those 4 police officers who initially attended the scene were all subject to criminal charges, being the offence of perjury or the offence of lying to PIC, and PIC being the Police Integrity Commission, which is an oversight body for New South Wales Police, which is no longer exists and has been replaced by LEC, which is the Law Enforcement Commission, Conduct Commission, I believe. So as a result of that, that incident, police were put before the court and tried, as anyone else would be, for any criminal behaviour. They were still working up until those dates, so it's very challenging for an individual officer to be working in the police and then the next day going before the court as the accused. But that's in fact what happens in the police. As a result of that, they were found not guilty on all charges. However, the aspect that's most important about that story from the police officer's perspective and what we teach in our 4-day training and our 1-day training is in fact that the exposure to that traumatic incident does affect not only the family, of course, they lost a member of their family as well as the remaining members of the family, but also the police officers involved. Because the police officers involved don't go there with the intention of killing or hurting a person, but simply where there's a need to do so, will use their firearm or other appointments, their other tactical options in order to reduce the risk or eliminate the risk. So if there's a risk to somebody else being hurt or killed, police have powers to stop that and utilise their appointments where necessary. So as a result of that, the police officers went through that process for about 7 years. And as a result of a process that's fairly draconian and authoritative in terms of what they can and can't do in that time, it also then exposes those police officers to the risk of becoming unwell, becoming mentally ill, disturbed, or having another condition. So as a result of that, eventually that matter was finalised, as I said, but those police officers will never be the same, nor am I, as a result of attending that incident. However, the nature of mental health and mental illness, as we discussed in that particular experience, is there is a degree of unpredictability with individuals because, as I said before, once you have a delusion or hallucination in terms of a mental illness, you will see things very differently. And we've seen that in the case of Courtney Topic, where she was standing there and many bypassers or people who were there at the time said it was like a zombie-like state, where she didn't appear to acknowledge the presence of the police. She didn't appear to comply with any directions, and what they call a blunt affect, which is a facial, a facial exposure where there doesn't seem to be any recognition of the individuals, people trying to talk to you, or messages coming in and out. Same applies, I guess, to Adam Salter, is that despite him knowing that what he was doing was likely to cause himself harm, he still did it irrespective of that, and that's about the nature of mental illness, where you lose insight and lose an understanding of what's actually going to happen to you, what the consequences might be. Very difficult situation and very challenging for members of the family who are present when a person goes into a mental illness or starts to be affected by an acute mental illness, such as psychosis through schizophrenia or another condition. And that means it's very challenging for them, as well as police and obviously ambulance as well, to manage that individual. So the difficulty with that incident, and I use the term difficulty in terms of the policing practice challenges, were that they didn't really have an opportunity to de-escalate. Had they have stayed in the room, and that was possibly one option for them at the time, although it was a very small room and already had 6 individuals, being 4 paramedics, 1 police officer, and Mr. Salter himself, they possibly could have stayed and maybe he would never have got to his feet. But effectively, at the time, they made decisions based on their policing practice, their experience, and their understanding of the nature of that incident. But again, as we saw in the outcome, it turned out very badly as a result of the unpredictability of the individual suffering from the mental illness. Now, as I said before, I'm not a clinician, I'm simply a police officer with, I guess, a number of years of experience, but certainly in terms of engaging with the public where there is a mental illness, disorder or disturbance, it is very challenging for police to manage that. When we talk to high-level specialists and psychiatrists in the area of mental illness, the approaches that we take and the methodologies we use aren't that dissimilar. So you might have a very highly qualified psychiatrist with up to 17 years of qualifications, so 17 years of learning around the area of mental health and mental illness. Then you might have a police officer who's received 1 day of training. Yet the principles of de-escalation don't change significantly. Certainly there might be a more greater capability in terms of the psychiatrist, but in terms of just de-escalating, using clear, coercive language, trying to gain a rapport with the individual, trying to talk to them and personalise the incident, try and calm them if it's possible. It doesn't change between those with great qualifications and those with very basic training. However, as you saw before with the number of incidents being attended by New South Wales Police, if there was in fact 10,000 less incidents attended by New South Wales Ambulance, there would be a significantly less number actually attended by a psychiatrist or a psychologist because they're not typically first responders. So you get an understanding that despite the training and qualifications that are provided, it doesn't necessarily lead to a better outcome in a high-risk situation. But we'll continue to have police respond as the first responders to these types of incidents for a couple of reasons. One, as I mentioned before, stigma, the fear of the public of what a mental illness represents, what could be caused, what harm could be provided to them or they could be exposed to. And two, the fact is that oftentimes people will believe that police are the best resource to attend and, I guess, calm the situation. But again, with the least capable qualifications in terms of clinical aspects of mental illness, and oftentimes with the least amount of equipment suitable. So, for example, New South Wales Ambulance carry mechanical restraint device, or MRDs, in their vehicles, which allow them to lock a person down who's being violent or posing a threat in the ambulance for purposes of transport. Police don't have that capability. Equally too, peridol is a chemical that's injected into certain patients based on a clinical assessment by New South Wales Ambulance, and that can also lead to a calming effect on the individual, and police don't have that. Police simply have their verbal commands and directions, as well as if the situation escalates and it becomes a high-level threat, they have their tactical options, as I talked about, on their belt, and obviously use of physical force if necessary. Under Section 81 of the Mental Health Act of 2007, police, health and health staff, that can be security at hospitals or other members of New South Wales Health, have the power to use force on an individual where there's a threat or a risk of public safety, meaning that they can actually try to help to calm the individual. But of course, people with clinical backgrounds in emergency departments aren't overly skilled or experienced in relation to subduing individuals who present a threat or a risk. Hence why hospitals have increasing numbers of security in order to deal with an individual in an ED department that might be posing a threat or acting in a way that compromises public safety. And as a result of that, security staff will step in. Of course, when it escalates, and we've seen this happen at Nepean Hospital a few years ago, where an individual actually was able to take possession of a police firearm and use that firearm on the officer. And of course, police need to respond to those high levels of need in emergency departments or health, and those matters are in fact covered for the agencies in the MOU, that Memorandum of Understanding that is publicly available on the intranet. So I guess coming around to what the process is for the mental health intervention team is that we will continue to train New South Wales police officers in the best way to deal with health situations where mental health particularly is an issue. Obviously, we'll look at a whole range of aspects in relation to de-escalation, and we continue to pursue our research around de-escalation. Recently, we were at Corrective Services at their academy at Eastwood, looking at their methodologies and approaches, if you like, towards de-escalating situations. And equally, we look overseas to see other law enforcement agencies, what they're doing and how they're managing these high risks. I guess it's an opportunity now, if you like, and we have a microphone available, if there are any questions that people would like to ask, either about that incident, if you've already studied it, or generally about policing practice around mental illness, I'm more than happy to answer them. And as you've seen from the presentation already, it's not an exact science. We can go there with very senior police who are highly experienced around the area. We can go there with highly tactical police, but it may not necessarily mean that it's a an easy matter to resolve or a peaceful resolution in all cases. So I'll open it to the floor. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those.
Why did the police remove Adam's father from the room when it was obvious he'd been able to de-escalate the situation initially? Well,
I guess police looked at it that Mr. Salter at the time probably didn't provide a great deal of reassurance for Adam because he'd already got to that stage where he was potentially with life-threatening injuries. If it was the case where the rapport between the father and the son was more effective and those injuries hadn't got to that point that they had got to, maybe police would have looked at a third-party assistance, which is what we call it. However, we try to discourage third parties from assisting in interventions only because we don't necessarily know what the person will say and we don't know if there are other factors or triggers behind it. So oftentimes allowing just the first responders only in the room or in the situation can have a more, I guess, clinical approach to the incident without any emotion being involved. And equally too, if the person says, oh, I want my father in the room, we would more than likely think that that would be an appropriate step to take if the father or the other individual family member is likely to support the first responders. But it's a difficult one to know, and to answer your question, I guess police did it on their best knowledge and experience of what they've done in the past, and equally thought that in the small area that they were working in, taking the father out was, I guess, a way of protecting him from seeing what might affect him down the track as well.
Actually, I think the reason why the father was removed was due to inexperience of the junior officers, like you said. Was there a reason why the junior officer was there in the first place? I mean, is that normal standard procedure to send juniors into a situation like that?
Well, with any police officer that's going through a probation period, they will attend every job that they go to with their training officer, irrespective of the nature of that job. On some occasions, it can be more prudent to ask the third officer or the learning officer or the training officer to step outside, just if it provides the family with a little bit more dignity and not a sense of a number of police being in the room. But in terms of the junior officer being present, completely normal process for police. In fact, on my very first day 32 years ago, I was exposed to, I guess, a high-risk incident, and being the youngest and fittest, I was the first person to arrive at the scene, but had no capability when I got there. I had to wait for the other older, more experienced police to turn up to know exactly what to do. However, it just shows you that police, once you join, and even in your probation, you'll be exposed to a whole range of issues and incidents, and we can't sort of pick and choose. In terms of whether or not it was the best person to leave in the room, I guess, unfortunately, we look back at that and say that history would indicate that it wasn't, but those decisions have been made in the past, and obviously we learn from them as an organisation.
Knowing that the knife was the, danger to Adam, why wasn't it removed at first port of call from the crime scene?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was actually a question I was asked by the Police Integrity Commission during the hearings. And they said, why wasn't the weapon properly secured? Well, the reality is that in instances where and I'll use the example of on the street, where we're wrestling somebody who might have a sharp-bladed instrument or weapon, simply removing it from their hand is deemed secured for us because they no longer have possession of it. So possession can be locked up in a cabinet, standing on that seat over there, or out of my arm's reach. And I guess because the police looked at the nature and extent of the injuries, they really didn't believe that Adam Salter could pose any greater threat. They certainly didn't believe, nor did the ambulance at the time, that he was likely to get to his feet again. And that's based on their clinical experience. I'm sure that if they thought that he was likely to get up, they would have said, can we get all the police just to stay in the room in case he gets up? So I think that there was a belief and understanding by all agencies at the time that he was unlikely to pose further threat. Certainly, had that knife not have gone, had been taken out of the house completely or removed in some other way, certainly it's highly likely that incident wouldn't have escalated to the point that it did, and in fact Adam Salter might be alive today. But again, these are all small incremental decisions that get made in the heat of battle, so to speak, when police and other agencies are, I guess, under pressure or adrenalised to deal with the situation. Certainly no excuses, but I can tell you and certainly give you assurance over 32 years that, as far as I'm concerned, a secure weapon is one that is no longer in the hands of the individual. And certainly circumstances like on a train, for example, a moving train carriage, a moving ambulance, or other situation really limits your capability of storing safely an object or a weapon. Young lady down the front.
So this is about the 4-day course. Is this the only is this like the only opportunity that police officers get to know more about understanding how to deal with someone with a mental illness, or is there any other courses like that available?
So in terms of structured courses, as I said, the 4-day is, I guess, the penultimate training available to police. And I don't have it on me today, but the police who complete that 4-day course actually get accredited with an MHIT badge. It's a small badge that appears above their name tag, and it shows ambulance, health and other police that they've got the training. And as I said, when we say training, we're talking 4 days. The reality is that police could obviously do with greater training across a whole range of areas, including mental illness. But the reality is that within every other piece of legislation and every other obligation in terms of custody, prisoner transport, domestic violence, all those areas that they attend, the reality is that's probably about the most appropriate means to train them. And over 4 days, we have to remember that police aren't clinicians. They'll never be clinicians. They simply just need to manage the risk and better understand that risk. And I guess the Adam Solder matter is a great example of that, where the lack of knowledge about could the person simply get up with the result of those injuries, then that would be handy information for the police to have known at the time they looked and believed that the person may not even get up again. So I guess that's the difference between their experience, what they know, what they knew then and what they know now. In terms of other training, we do deliver bespoke training to business units within the police who have specialised needs, such as, and I'll use the example of the fixated persons unit, where people, as I said before, who are having fundamentalist or extreme views online, that they might have specific personality disorders or behaviours that police need to understand and interpret. But otherwise, generally speaking, as not the lead agency for mental health, despite the high number of incidents we go to, the organisation believes that the 4-day training is sufficient. I can say that we've had police who have got no specific training, certainly no 4-day training, who have successfully resolved 14,700 or so last year, and many of those had no training beyond their 1-day training at the academy. So I guess there's the balance between how much training can we give and what training do they really need.
As the police are first responders to these things, do you feel that they're under-resourced in the amount of tools they have, only having like tactical, like guns and tasers? Could they be resourced with similar stuff to what ambulances use?
I guess by virtue of the nature of the roles is that they're often mobile, so you'll see police on foot, you'll see police on bicycles as well as motorcycles. In order to carry more equipment, there'd obviously be more of an obligation for only certain police in certain vehicles to be able to carry that. And I guess we need to make that important distinction between, I guess, what the role of police is versus ambulance. We don't ever want to encroach on their territory. They're well trained, they're clinically trained, they have a whole range of skills that police simply don't have. But likewise, in a public safety situation, they want the police there because the police have the right set of tools to, I guess, address the public safety concerns. So I guess it's one of those areas where police, to some extent, carry around a personal protective equipment on their belt as well for the purposes of CPR or immediate first aid. But effectively, we recognise the limitations of what police as investigators or law enforcement officers are, and reflect the fact that their role is simply to maybe first respond and call the ambulance, apply pressure, whatever might be needed from a clinical perspective, but then knowing that the next layer of response will be ambulance, and therefore they've got the clinical resources. And it's the fine line, I guess, between law enforcement and first response clinical care. And as I said, I joined the police, I guess, to protect and serve, as corny as that might sound. But the reality is that the protection really only extends to public safety and threats and risks, rather than any health aspects that may be experienced or suffered by individuals. Certainly, I can assure you that as a police officer, despite needing other police officers at times when incidents go awry, is that the next agency that I want to attend is New South Wales Ambulance, because I know that they're the ones who can actually treat me if I get injured, and equally be on hand to treat other people should they be injured as a result of the interventions with police. We couldn't work without each other. It's interesting though, when you look at small country towns in rural and remote locations, they often have a situation where they have one ambulance officer and one police officer. So it's not like the city where I can call, and Bankstown was a good example, 7 cars could turn up to my job if I call for assistance. Whereas if you're 400 kilometres away from the head station, you're it until the police can arrive at that scene. And by road, that can be 45 minutes to an hour. And it's up to you to be the sole responder for that incident. It's a great deal of pressure we put on our police, young and old, and certainly a great deal of expectation we put on New South Wales Ambulance to maintain the health of an individual.
Do you believe that the 2 police officers that were at the scene of Adam Salter's death were punished appropriately, not just for their actions at the time, but for the cover-up or the misinterpretation of their actions that was shown on the Four Corners?
Yeah, obviously happy to address it. Don't forget, Four Corners came out before the results of the court, so they didn't know that they were cleared. They didn't know there wasn't sufficient evidence to charge them. It simply raised a suspicion. Just to correct you too, there was 4 officers there. A probationary constable was 6 months, a leading senior constable with about 10 years service, an acting sergeant with about 14 years service, and the female sergeant, who's also out of my class at the academy, with 22 years service at that time. In terms of punishment, I guess you have to have committed an offence first. And whilst it was tragic that Adam Salter lost his life in that incident, it was not subject to any criminal matters. That the fact that he was shot and killed, it was only about whether or not police had actually covered up or misused information or contrived information. And as I say to the ambulance courts, because they raise it with us a lot, because the ambulance evidence was somewhat different to the police evidence, is if you look at Section 20 of the Mental Health Act, New South Wales Ambulance have a very broad spectrum of care and support for the individual, and often involve the individual in the decision making for their care and treatment, whereas New South Wales Police really only there to protect an individual from killing or seriously injuring themselves or another person, and therefore the application, if you like, of the 2 sections actually reflect what happened on the day of the incident with Salter, is that ambulance went in there with a very compassionate, kind approach to try and maintain the individual's life and if possible, fix their injuries or certainly fix them to the extent of getting them to hospital, whereas police have the additional responsibility not only of getting them to hospital if necessary, but also protecting everyone else in the room. Simply, it's a responsibility that ambulance don't have. And so when they gave their evidence, I believe that why it contradicted a lot of the police evidence is because it was looked at from 2 completely different perspectives, compassionate and clinical versus public safety and law enforcement. And I say that to ambulance classes as we go, even as recently as 2 weeks ago, because it's probably the best way of understanding how did 2 agencies who were there for the same reason look at things so differently? And it's about their obligations and responsibilities. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Those 2 officers that were in, what's the term, caught up in this thing, did they ever get, instead of going back into the force and instead of being stood down, could they have got on to light duties before the court date? Because you said...
certainly, through the course, and I probably didn't explain it in great detail, but certainly with all 4 officers, there was different times where they were off work because of the pressures that they faced, so being off on sick report, maybe being reassigned to other duties, not having access to their firearms, being under a plan or a workforce improvement notice, so to speak. Excuse me. But certainly not as a punishment. Obviously, the police officers may have felt that was felt like a punishment leading up to, because you've got to remember, 2009 to 2016, it's a long time to preempt the punishment of an individual when they're then found to be cleared of any wrongdoing. Because you could turn around and say, well, we applied all these sanctions for 7 years and then found out the police officers were in fact not guilty of any offence. So therefore, what have we actually done to them in terms of their employability, their career progression, etc. Certainly those police officers, and I can speak broadly for them, having known them for some period of time, they feel that the things that were applied to them in terms of sanctions were more than sufficient given the outcome of what transpired at court.
And I'm guessing things have changed since then anyway with the police force. They don't
Well, look, it's a great opportunity for me to tell you this, that last year when I arrived at the mental health intervention team, I looked at the work that they were doing and looked at the de-escalation activities they were involved with. We considered, given the fact that I'd been involved in the Adam Salter shooting and also certainly reviewed other critical incidents with New South Wales Police, that we brought in a Stop Our De-escalation model. Now, Stop Our De-escalation, I talked about it a little bit earlier when we spoke, is really about slowing things down. So stopping, thinking about the situation, applying a greater perspective on assessing the risks and then reviewing their decisions. So again, always planning and reviewing. What I can tell you, and I guess it's good news, is that as a result of Stop R being implemented last year, there were 0 police shootings resulting in death for mentally ill people, which is a significant outcome given the fact that on average there were 4 to 5 people shot and killed by New South Wales Police, predominantly as a result of a mental illness in the previous years. So we've gone from way too many people, one's been too many, right down to 0 last year. So I can say that what have we done about it? Effectively, we've brought in an approach for police to help them and I guess to authorise them to slow things down and to use distance, not to feel obligated to rush in and resolve a matter straight away, which is oftentimes what adrenalised police may feel. I'm here, I'm the community's guardian, I need to fix this straight away. And oftentimes we see that as a result of those low-level timeframes between police arrival and an actual shooting, which currently is 45 seconds in New South Wales. And we're all about slowing that down, using greater time and using greater distance. And I guess arguably the results are there from last year.
What about the police officers' mental well-being? So for the police officers that were involved not only with Adam Salter but in all, with Topic as well, etc. What happens with police officers' mental well-being?
Well, obviously there's some limitations what I can tell you because each individual has a right to privacy about their own medical treatment, both whether they're a police officer or not. What I can say is certainly the shared experience was that when you feel isolated, and this is stands for everyone in the community, when you feel isolated, when you feel that you're being viewed in a negative light or that pejorative terms are being used about you in your presence or otherwise, you'll oftentimes feel isolated. That isolation can lead to a sense of hopelessness, helplessness, or even just a sense that your contribution, whether it's past contributions or future contributions, are stymied in a way because people see you of lesser value. And I can certainly say in my own experience that over that period of time I certainly felt the elements of mental illness as a result of that time of going through a process where I didn't know what the outcome would be. Was I going to have employment? Was my job at risk? What was going to happen to my family? So absolutely, there's significant factors. And oftentimes when police, you watch the news and you see police engaged in activities, you think, oh, okay, well, they did that one and they went on to the next job. We forget completely that those individual officers and ambulance officers, and those certainly in the military as well, are often left with scars, emotional scars, exposed to the trauma that we never see, but are certainly living with them day to day, and they're expected pretty much after that job to go to the very next job and the next job after that without little time to recover or certainly a little time to have those incidents or those issues resolved in their lives. Certainly in terms of emotional issues and aspects to police, I can only assure you that there's a lot of police and first responders out there who are affected by post-traumatic stress disorder and other illnesses related to those exposures.
And finally, what services are in place for police officers that go through, I guess, what you've just explained?
What services?
Yep.
Certainly, every New South Wales police officer has 24/7 access to the Employee Assistant Program, which is a government contract with New South Wales Police and other agencies where they can call up to make appointments to see a psychologist. Certainly we encourage New South Wales police officers, if they've been exposed to trauma and if it's unsettling them, that they go and see their GP and seek medical advice. It's just like any other injury, and this is where stigma comes in, is that we shouldn't treat people differently because they've been injured psychologically than if they're injured physically. Yet if a workmate comes into the office 2 days after a major fray or riot with a broken arm or a bandage, they're accepted a lot easier than the individual comes in and says, oh, I'm feeling unwell, I'm feeling like I've lost my confidence. It truly is a different a way of being treated in the workplace as it is in the community, hence why it's difficult for people to come forward and talk about their mental illness.
Yeah, this is a question for everybody, not just for you. Did Ray Hadley ever apologise for his comments? Ray Hadley was on that video that you just showed, and he came out on the side that the police were allowed to shoot this person.
Oh, sorry, you're talking about, that only showed the 2 minutes.
Yeah.
In the broader perspective.
In the broader one, yeah?
Yeah, in the broader one, which I haven't seen for some period of time, I must be honest.
It does have, like you're talking about stigma,
yeah.
It does play a major role in presenting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we've found through the passage of time, that some of those individuals, even possibly the one you mentioned, have also undergone some emotional experiences, if you like, or trauma that have led them to have their personality disorders or other illnesses identified and possibly diagnosed. But oftentimes when it happens, we don't, because there's no physical injury, we think we're okay. It's only over the passage of time or when they're exposed to other incidents in life, and it could be life issues rather than professional issues, that those possible injuries come to light and then start to affect and impede our quality of life. Thank you. Thanks.